let's continue digging into hypocrisy and tolerance. Okay, so tolerance, remember, has a bad aspect built into it. Remember, it's not just I tolerate, it's not just indifference, right? Because I can be indifferent about a lot of things, right? I'm indifferent about certain things. Means I don't really take any action either way. I don't really have an opinion or whatever. You would say, okay, if you're indifferent about something, you're not tolerating it. And if I like something and I don't act on it or whatever, you wouldn't say you tolerate it either. So indifference or non-interference that we've seen is not really a good notion or a good underpinning or explication of tolerance. We need some kind of bad aspect. You know, when you tolerate X, that means that X is, at least you think X is bad. Maybe X is okay. And we'll look at that under later in the video under this notion of a context of toleration. But just for now, we're just assuming that X is bad and in some demonstrable and acceptable way, like rationally acceptable way. So that's really the underpinning of the notion of it. But it may not always be. Again, we'll look at this in a little more detail when we back up a bit and look at the context of toleration. But for now, tolerating X means it has some bad aspect. Is this something that should be unlimited when, right, we're talking about liberal societies that say, yeah, you should tolerate. That's a good thing. Toleration is a good thing. And as we saw, you know, toleration might breed hypocrisy, but the hypocrisy that's bred might encourage people to be more rational than they really are. So they might have kind of, you know, hypocritical sorts of notions, but because they have to present their ideas publicly, what they want publicly, they have to be a bit hypocritical, but they're being rational in their hypocrisy. So we cooked up something where liberalism could encourage a kind of hypocrisy, but it's not necessarily bad, right? All right. So should a liberal, but should liberal societies tolerate everything? You know, unlimited? Should a liberal society tolerate anything? Should it tolerate its own destruction? You know, this is an old problem in political science, sometimes called the paradox of tolerance, that tolerance contains sort of the seeds of its own destruction. I think it's easy to confuse tolerance with pacifism. Now, pacifism, if you take it strictly, pacifism, most people think pacifism is like, I don't throw the first punch, but if you hit me, look out. That's not pacifism. Pacifism is really, I'm nonviolent completely, no matter what you do. So it's quite a strict and austere doctrine, right? So it basically will tolerate, you know, like if you're really a super strict pacifist, you may be willing to, you know, be destroyed in some process because you will not engage in violence. And if the others are using violence, you could be in for a terrible end. Okay, so I want to split and say, you know, look, liberal isn't really pacifism. And so liberal, we might be able to generate sort of an idea about, you know, like there's got to be some sorts of limits, like liberalism and toleration. So we're going to dial this down a bit, that liberalism doesn't have to accept its own destruction. But are there cases where we can talk about like justifiable liberal intolerance, right? And I think there are, right? And it's going to be connected with other values. So what I want to say is that liberalism and hypocrisy, and there's all these values, this is kind of a larger flexible framework. But let's see what happens here. Suppose I believe, just for the sake of the discussion, I believe X, and X is kind of unsavory stuff, or ridiculous, or uninformed, or whatever, right? And you are well informed, and you're looking at my thing that I believe X, and you're, you know, looking at this and going, you're badly scientifically ill-formed, or you're not really understanding things properly. This is a weird view you have. Maybe it's immoral. Maybe it's just scientifically incorrect. You know, something, whatever. You might want to say that you as a liberal should basically, respecting my autonomy and respecting me as a rational individual, even though on this particular X, you might say that's not a rational belief. But I still believe that you are not simply constituted by your social relations, and you're simply not constituted solely by what you happen to believe at a given moment, because it's goofy right now. But I'm going to say, you're going to say to me, you're more than this. There's something that I can reach by trying to engage with you to persuade you to stop believing X. In other words, I am going to, as a liberal, I will speak the truth. I will start with a kind of intolerance. Now I'm going to argue against you. I'm going to confront your beliefs. I'm not going to just tolerate them and be, oh, I don't like them, but I'm not interfering. No, I'm interfering, right? So my first obligation, kind of in this liberal sense, would be, I might say, look, I have competing values that are in my liberalism, a loyalty to truth, yeah, like a respect for the rational self, right? Or you have this loyalty to truth, you have this respect for the rational, my rational self, and my rational self's autonomy, where you'd say, oh, to treat a rational self autonomously is going to be met with argument. Not like you're not going to threaten me with physical force to change my mind, or scare me or intimidate me. No, you're going to try and argue with me because you're saying, look, you respect me as a rational individual, even though this current belief is not all that rational. And so this first obligation of loyalty to truth, respect for the rational self that you're engaging, and its autonomy would manifest itself as persuasion. Right. So liberal intolerance can be like, no, we're going to it's nonviolent, but nonetheless it's not tolerating. It's intolerant. I don't tolerate. You could say to me, I'm not tolerating your belief. I'm going to challenge you on this, and that's a form of intolerance, because you're not just letting it go, even though you don't like it. You're just not letting it go. You're interfering. But of course, persuasion doesn't always work. And persuasion didn't work. And then I go about maintaining my wicked ways and my goofy beliefs and all that stuff. But you say, well, no, I'm going to continue to respect, you continue to respect my autonomy and tolerate my belief in X. Now, that doesn't mean I get to just believe anything whatsoever. But there would be, I'm just making the point that in some sense of you could have a liberal intolerance where that would be your first step, is to be intolerant, as in this liberal sense of the term. Now there could be liberalism, because it's a flexible framework that I want to talk about, could have different paths. You might start with liberal intolerance and then move on to tolerance. Another example, and we see complexities arising over different views on world events. Protests. We're seeing a lot of protests these days. Civil authorities might decide, they've taken different approaches in different ways, but a civil authority that is of a liberal bent might encounter a protest movement with tolerance. It's like, yeah, okay. And I've seen this done in a variety of situations. You can protest here, do your thing. So we'll tolerate presence. It's not like that civil authorities like when there's protests, because they tend to be disrupted. That's the whole idea of a protest. So you can protest here and do your thing. So there's kind of that toleration. It's something we don't like that much, and it could be causing real inconvenience, which many protesters say, hey, that's what we're here to do, is to cause an inconvenience. We're not things. So it's not like introducing something that people like. It's introducing something people don't like, but it's done in the name of some kind of cause. But in any case, there is an amount of tolerance here. So do your thing. We tolerate the presence. Okay, but this sort of toleration of presence is often, limited. So persuasion will soon kick in. Okay, you guys, it's time to get going, or something like that. You see these patterns generally in various governments and civil authorities. So persuasion will kick in, and then eventually it will, can't stay forever, and then there will be a request to leave, and then force may be used. So these are all ways of working things out. And you have this notion of liberalism can be a flexible framework. Of course, all the arguments are going to be with all the details of, how far this is to go. What exactly does that mean? How is this going to work? Persuasion, some people say that's a threat. Anyways, but just to get sort of an overall structure, that liberalism can be a flexible framework, all things considered. All right, so this has been sort of a bit of a dive into liberalism, and so how do we split hypocrisy and tolerance and all that? It's not easy. It's clearly not easy to do. We might say that toleration, something like this, that we might say that toleration tends to benefit the person who, or the organization that's being tolerated, and hypocrisy not so much. But that doesn't work all that well, because sometimes, toleration may not be a good thing. Maybe you might have this, maybe you will respect someone's autonomy and tolerate their belief in something that's really bad for them. And maybe you shouldn't tolerate that belief. There's lots of debates about that. People want to do things that maybe are self-destructive that they believe are good for them. Should they, should that be allowed? Should that be tolerated? It's, there's a context to that, whether or not that's a good thing. So toleration may not always be a good thing, right? And of course, toleration, can be a bad thing if you say, well, you have to just tolerate everything. Tolerate your own destruction or something like that. So toleration, just saying that toleration is always kind of a beneficial thing, maybe doesn't work all that well. And we've seen repeatedly that hypocrisy is not always a bad thing, right? And especially we saw in a previous video, where hypocrisy, getting the rich guy, if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back to a previous video, getting the rich guy to donate money. You're being a little hypocritical by kind of acting like you sort of believe what he thinks, but you get him to donate a big pile of money because he thinks you're on his side, but he donates to a good cause that he normally wouldn't donate to if you weren't being a hypocrite. Fine. But, you might actually be hypocritical not just for the cause, but you might also be a little bit of a hypocrite to help this guy become a better person, right? Yeah, I was hypocritical with that guy because I knew he'd give a lot of money. And once he gave money to this cause, he might think, oh, hey, this is a good thing. I'll give a little bit more. Maybe my views on certain things are not so great. So maybe you can be hypocritical to someone in order to get them to change their ways. So, we probably wouldn't call that hypocrisy, but it is a kind of hypocrisy. It involves duplicitous behavior on a person's part to deceive the other in a certain way, but that could bring about a good way. Like sometimes, even modeling, people will model good behavior that they may not necessarily really come naturally, but they'll model it to get others to be better. So sometimes playing the hypocrite can even benefit the person who receives the hypocrisy. So it's not that easy to split all this stuff. So it's, but I don't think we want to say that hypocrisy, tolerance, and all these things are the same thing, because we just don't use them that way. We do have differences in them. But again, how to lay them all out nice and neatly, like this is what one is, this is what the other, and how it's split, and why this is always wrong, or why, that seems to be extremely difficult, if not impossible to do. But remember, think about tolerance as well. Why we also sometimes want to ask people, like, why do you need to be tolerant? And if tolerance, so I'm going back to this notion of the bad aspect. Sometimes people will say they tolerate certain things, and you'll be thinking, well, you shouldn't have to tolerate that. You should be okay with that. So keep in mind that toleration in a wider context could be something horrible. Like if somebody says, well, I tolerate a certain group of people, and you say, what do you mean you tolerate them? You think that they're all bad to begin with, and you're just thinking that you're being good by tolerating them? Think about that kind of logic. And the way to really see that is note that certain groups, certain activists on behalf of certain groups, they rarely, if ever, do they ask for toleration. They don't. They ask for acceptance. They ask for celebration or whatever. Because if you say, well, I want you to tolerate the group that I belong to, you're almost implicitly agreeing that you have some bad aspect that needs to be tolerated. No, if I'm defending a group or whatever, I'm not asking for people to be tolerant. I'm asking for acceptance. Two very different things. So even the context of tolerance is not always clear, because sometimes that could be, if someone says, well, I tolerate a group or whatever, you might think, oh my God, that says something very terrible about the person that's doing the tolerating, not the group that's being tolerated. So this one can be a bit tricky. So you got to be careful about that one, because it always turns on who and what and where are the arguments and who gets to say what the bad aspect really is in order to get even the concept of tolerance off the ground. All right, so what's the upshot? Well, certainly, as I mentioned before, it's not clear as to where tolerance ends, hypocrisy begins, how they relate, and we looked at it in the context of one kind of political system, that could encourage it, but it may not be a bad thing if it does. But there's probably just we have to look at this on a case-by-case basis. Some cases where we can clearly split tolerance, hypocrisy, some cases we can't, and some cases we can say one is a good thing, one isn't, and that's probably about the best we can do. But anyways, that doesn't mean that there's not a lot more to say, but this is just starting to scratch the surface of this complex relationship between hypocrisy, tolerance, and a little bit on liberalism. See you next video.